This week in trading history, your favorite topic. What do you got for us this
I've
week, Patrick?
I've taken over this because I have no skill whatsoever to create WTF videos, so I have to do something.
I think it was more that I was so lazy, and you were just like, I better do it because he's not going to do it. But anyways, what do you got for us this week? You're so good at it.
All right. Well, we're going back to July 25th of 1893, and to the low point of the Panic of 1893. And when I started doing the homework on this, I was like, I could not believe how much history rhymes.
Oh, yeah.
Like this is fascinating story. And so let's get it right into it. So number one, until the Great Depression happened, it was considered the worst depression in the United States that they've ever experienced. And so it took the Great Depression to be worse. And it's amazing how we usually stop at the Great Depression and don't go any further back. But just going back 125, 130 years, there was what was a really Great Depression, and very few people know about it or understand it anyway. And the panic was marked by a collapse of railroad overbuilding and shaky railroad financing, which set off a whole series of bank failures. Compounding that was that the market was overbuilding the railroad bubble burst, and there was a huge run on the gold supply relative to silver, because back then the Sherman Act, which I want to save for actually another session, but there was a huge run on the gold supply. So let's kind of work first of all what happened prior to this. In order to build it up. So it was in the 1880s, was a period of remarkable economic expansion in the United States, an expansion that eventually became driven by huge railroad speculation. And obviously, just a few episodes ago, we were talking about the transport index, but Charles Dow and Edward Jones basically put together the transport index because of the bubble in these transports, right? This is why this happened, and they put it together in 1884. It was because there was this massive boom in railroads, and they wanted to track this build of the railroads. And so there was a huge overbuild, and back then M&A activity was huge. Everyone taking all the different railroads, doing all this crazy financing to take over its competitors, and it endangered their own stability. It was just a huge boom, very much like what we see in different sectors in today's markets. But what's interesting is the farmers, particularly in the Midwest, were suffering during this period. Particularly, they suffered from a series of massive droughts, which left them short of cash to pay their debts, which drove their down the value of their land and created a huge rout of bankruptcies in the farming space during that period. And so what ended up happening, it was in 1890, the Sherman Purchase Act was passed. And I'm not going to go into detail because actually it was such a fascinating story, so I have to save it for a separate This Week in History. So I'm not going to get into detail there. We'll save it for another one. But what was interesting was the farmers had immense amounts of debts that could not be paid off due to the deflation that was occurring because they were on a gold standard. And so they urged the passing of the Sherman Purchase Act in order to boost the economy and cause inflation to allow them to pay off their debts in cheaper dollars. Wow, like you go back then, and even back then they understood the concept of inflation and how money supply and all of these different things and paying off debts with cheaper dollars. It's not just a modern thing. This was going on back then, right?
Patrick, inflating away your debts is as old as time.
Yes, you're right.
It's only you deflationists that think that it's never going to happen today.
Okay, anyway. To be continued. So one of the first signs of trouble was the bankruptcy of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, which had greatly overextended itself. And in February of 1893, 10 days before Grover Cleveland's second inauguration, upon being named president, he basically dealt with the Treasury Crisis by basically repealing this Sherman Silver Act, which he at the time felt was responsible for the crisis. So that Sherman Act was enacted 3 years earlier, and then as it came into the crisis, it repelled it. But what happened was that the concern of the state of the economy worsened. People rushed to withdraw their money from the banks because the fear that there would be all of this repercussions from doing this, and it caused a massive bank run. And everyone basically thought that the banks were going to go under, so they all made the bank run, and it caused this massive credit crunch that rippled through the whole economy. To exacerbate this, there was at the same time in London a financial panic in the United Kingdom, and a massive drop in trade with Europe that caused foreign investors to have to sell these American stocks to obtain American funds that were backed by gold at the time. And so it was just a massive, self-feeding loop. And what's interesting is that the investments during the time of the panic were heavily financed through bond issuance with high interest payments. And one of those companies, the most actively traded stock at the time, was the National Cordage Company that went into receivership as a result of all these banks calling in their loans as a response to the rumors of a financial distress, but also because they were having bank runs on their end. And so they're calling in the loans. And the company, which at the time was cornering the market for importing hemp, basically imploded. And so at the time, the demand for silver and silver notes also fell in value, and the holders were worried about the loss of the face value of their bonds, of which were rightfully so. Many of those bonds became completely worthless on that front. And so this led to a series of bank failures that followed. Northern Pacific Railway went under. Union Pacific Railroad went under. The Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe railroads failed. You had massive bankruptcies that followed. Get this, a total of 15,000 companies failed that year, including 500 banks in the West. So you had a scenario where, according to estimates, the unemployment hit near like 17 to 19% of the workforce. The unemployment led to panics. There was huge spike in that. Many people's life savings were completely wiped out as all these bank failures left the middle class completely broke. Many of them couldn't meet their mortgage obligations and walked away from their recently built homes. It just like became one massive gong show.
Yeah, but think about from an Austrian perspective how awesome this was. It cleansed out the system.
Yeah. Hard money rules. So
hard money. It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
One other interesting echo that is worth kind of looking at from history. While it didn't, I don't know how much it contributed to the panic itself, but what was amazing was that during this panic was when in the United States there was a huge populist movement by the People's Party. And it was a agrarian populist party that basically rose to power on the left-wing side and drew huge support from angry farmers and in the West and from the South. And guess what? They were critical of capitalism, of banking, of railroads, and they completely allied themselves with the labor movement at the time. And so at their peak, a year before the crisis in 1892, they were on the ticket for the presidential elections and won like 8.5% of the popular vote and took like 5 states at the time. And so it was a huge movement. And again, it was these populists crusading against the hostility of elites, of cities, of banks, of railroads, and the use of gold. And so you had this huge angry movement at the same time as this crisis. And so it's amazing how we see such a populist movement today. And you can go back at the time for a little bit of history of when that actually was happening.
For sure. It's a great story.
Yeah.
You know, Patrick, I have to say one thing.
Okay. Tell me.
As anyone that listens to us knows that we both mess up words all the time. And I
Which one
for
did I miss
sure,
up?
Well, so first of all, I'm basically Billy Joel in front of a glass house. I should not be saying this. But
All
it
right,
made
make
laugh,
fun of me.
so
No, make fun of me. What did I
Okay.
pronounce wrong?
So Groover Cleveland, he's a funky dude. Is he Groover?
Grover?
Yeah, you said Groover. I was like, okay, let's go with Groover Cleveland.
I need another beer.
Okay, Groover Cleveland. Okay, so listen, where else will you find listen a little bit of financial history and finding out what Groover Cleveland was up to 100 years ago. Thanks a lot, Patrick.
All right.